I want you to picture the last few hours before everything changed. Not the divorce announcement, not the poems, not the social media speculation that followed for months, the hours before all of that, when it was still just two people inside a palace, and one of them had already made up her mind. Most people who cover this story start at the end. They tell you she left, they tell you he regretted it, they tell you the poetry that came after, but nobody has ever taken you inside those final hours until today, because what happened inside Hamdan's palace in the hours before his wife walked out, the conversations, the silences, the moments that cannot be unseen, is the real story, and it will change the way you understand everything that came after. Let us go back, hour by hour, to the day that ended everything. Sheikh Hamdan's second marriage had been under quiet strain for some time, not the kind of strain that announces itself in arguments or public scenes, but the deeper, more dangerous kind, the kind that lives in unspoken things. His wife had been paying attention, the way perceptive women always do, to the small signals that most people miss. The poems that were not for her, the emotional distance that appeared after certain conversations, the weight of a history she had not been part of but could not escape. And then came the event that shifted everything. Sheikh Hamdan's trip to London to visit Shaker, his first wife, at the quiet encouragement of his father. When he returned from that trip, something had changed in the atmosphere of the palace. She felt it immediately. Not in anything dramatic, he said or did, but in the particular quality of his silences. The way a person who has revisited something important carries it back with them, even when they try not to. She spent the days after his return watching, thinking, reaching a conclusion that she had perhaps been approaching for much longer than she admitted to herself. And then came the final day. The palace woke, the way it always did, with the controlled, choreographed rhythm of a household that runs on protocol. Staff moving through corridors, the distant sounds of preparation for the day ahead, but inside their private quarters, a different kind of quiet had settled. She woke early, before him, and she lay still for a while, not because she was tired, but because she was preparing herself. The way a person prepares before a difficult conversation they have been putting off for too long. She had made a decision the night before, and the morning had not changed it. She got up, got dressed, and waited. It began as many life changing conversations do, with something small, a question, a comment, the kind of ordinary exchange that would be completely forgettable in any other context, but in the charged atmosphere of that morning, carried the full weight of everything that had been left unsaid for months. She raised the subject she had been circling for weeks: his first wife, his feelings, the London visit, the poems. She did not raise it aggressively. She was not built for aggression. She raised it the way a woman raises something when she already knows the answer, not to fight, but to confirm, to finally have, out loud and in the open, the truth she had been living with in private. Sheikh Hamdan listened. He always listened. That was one of the things she had loved about him. He did not interrupt, did not deflect, did not immediately reach with a comfortable lie. He was quiet for a long time, and then he spoke. What he said in that moment, we have covered in detail in a previous video, but the effect of his words on her was immediate and permanent, not devastating in the way of shock, but devastating in the way of confirmation. The quiet collapse of a hope she had been protecting for a very long time. After that conversation, she walked through the palace alone. This detail, small as it sounds, matters. Because in a household like this one, there is always someone nearby: staff, assistants, family members, security. Solitude is something that must be actively sought. She sought it that morning. She moved through rooms she had tried to make her own, spaces she had arranged, corners she had chosen, surfaces that held small objects she had brought from her family home when she moved in, the evidence of her attempts to belong somewhere that had never fully accepted her. She did not cry. Not then. She walked. And she thought. And somewhere in those 4 hours, the decision that had been forming for weeks became something solid and final inside her. She was going to leave. Not in anger, not in desperation, in clarity. She made a phone call to her family, the people who had known her longest, who had watched her enter this marriage with hope and had watched quietly and helplessly as that hope slowly dimmed. The call was not long. She did not need to explain much. The people who truly know you rarely require detailed explanations. She told them she was coming home. Those 4 words, "I am coming home," were the mirror image of the 4 words that had brought her to the palace in the first place, and they carried, in their quietness, everything that had happened in between. After the call, she sat for a while, just sat for a while, just sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the city, the same city she had looked at on her first day in the palace, full of possibility, the same skyline, a completely different feeling. She did not reach for her phone, did not scroll, did not seek distraction. She simply sat with what was about to happen and let herself feel the full weight of it before she stood up and walked toward it. She found him. Whatever passed between them in that final hour is something that belongs only to them. And I will not pretend to know the exact words, the exact tone, the exact texture of a conversation that private, but what those close to the situation have shared suggests something that is, in its way, more painful than a dramatic confrontation would have been. It was calm, two people who had genuinely cared for each other, and in his case, still did, reaching the end of something without shouting, without bitterness, without the theatrical rupture that we associate with endings in films and television, just two adults in a palace in Dubai, acknowledging quietly that what they had built together had not survived the weight placed upon it. She did not ask him to stop her, and he did not. She walked out of the palace the way she had always moved through it, with composure, with dignity, without looking back. The car that took her to her family's home moved through Dubai traffic like any other car. No sirens, no ceremony, no announcement, just a woman going home. Inside the palace, Sheikh Hamdan was left alone with the particular silence that follows a departure. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a room that used to have someone in it. That silence, by all accounts, stayed with him for a very long time. In the days that followed, the palace continued as palaces do. Official duties resumed. Appearances were kept. The machinery of power does not pause for private grief. And Sheikh Hamdan understood this better than most. He had been trained his entire life to carry personal weight without allowing it to show. But those who worked closely with him noticed something. He wrote more. In the weeks after she left, his poetry output increased significantly, poem after poem. Some shared publicly, some kept private, poured out of him with an urgency that had not been present in his work for some time. The poems were not angry. They were not self pitying. They were honest. They spoke of regret in a specific way that only someone who understands their own role in a loss can speak of it, not blaming circumstances or fate or the complexity of royal life, but acknowledging quietly and repeatedly that choices had been made and consequences had followed. I gave you a hand that was already holding something else. Forgive me, not because I deserve it, but because you deserve the freedom of it. That line from one of the poems written in this period tells you everything about where Sheikh Hamdan's understanding had arrived. He was not asking her to come back, he was asking her to be free. That is not the request of a man who does not understand what he did. That is the request of a man who understands it completely and knows that understanding it does not undo it. I want to say something now that I think is important. We live in a world that is obsessed with the dramatic version of every story, the confrontations, the betrayals, the explosive moments that make for compelling headlines. But the most significant things that happen between two people almost never look like that. What happened inside Hamdan's palace in those final hours was not dramatic. There was no screaming, no thrown object, no moment that would work well as a scene in a film. There was just truth. Truth spoken carefully in a private room between two people who had tried their best with what they had and were finally, painfully, acknowledging that their best had not been enough. Sheikh Hamdan's second wife deserves to be remembered not as a footnote in a prince's love story, but as a woman who exercised extraordinary courage in one of the most difficult positions imaginable. She loved someone who could not fully return that love. She recognized it, she named it, and she left, not in defeat, but in the full dignity of someone who refuses to negotiate her own worth. And Sheikh Hamdan, for all the complexity of his situation, deserves credit for one thing. When she asked him the truth, he told it. He did not lie to preserve the comfort of the marriage. He honored her enough to be honest, even when honesty cost him everything. Both of those choices, her courage in leaving, his courage in telling the truth, happened inside that palace. in the hours we just walked through together. That is what really happened inside Hamdan's palace, in the hours before she left. Not a scandal, not a betrayal in the dramatic sense, but something quieter and harder and more human than any of that. Two people meeting the truth of their situation and choosing, each in their own way, to face it honestly. I hope this video gave you a window into that story that you have not seen before. That is always my intention here, to go deeper than the headlines, to find the human beings inside the royal narrative. If it did that for you today, please share it. And if you are new here, subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stories like this one. Until next time.